All right, guys and gals, we are back again. Um, gonna do some. How do I say this without getting in legal trouble? We're gonna be busting some myths. Yeah, that's how we'll say it. We're not gonna be myth busters. No. And the myth we're busting today is, does ink kind of go through evolutions, or have there been cases where an ink which was once a fantastic ink became a very crappy ink? And the best example I can think of in regards to that is the famous, the once beloved Higgins Black Magic. All right, so what we're going to be doing, I do have some vintage Higgins Black Magic when it was made by Faber-Castell. It's an old ink. I won't be using that as a accurate representation of what the ink was like back then, because some of the pigment has settled over time and it's not quite as thick as it should be. But what I do remember is I did use Black Magic ink quite a lot in the beginning of my comic pursuits. As a illustrator and as an inker, this was my go-to. This is what I used in my rapidographs. This is what I used on my dip pens. This is what I used. And I used it in brush. I used to use ink washes with it, and it was a great ink. So first, a little backstory. Initially, Higgins Black Magic, I'm not quite sure when it was released, but supposedly the formula idea came from the acquisition of another company, and they released the Higgins Black Magic. Now, at some point, the Higgins brand was acquired by Faber-Castell, and they were making the ink in Newark, New Jersey. Then in the 90s, around 1992, the Higgins brand was sold to Sanford, which is a Newell company, Rubbermaid, Sharpie. They own a bunch of different brands. And then in around 2012, I believe, it was sold to Chartpak. And Chartpak now also owns Koh-i-Noor and a couple other things. And there has been some changes to the inks, such as Ultra Draw. I did notice some similar changes. So what exactly happened to the inks, and were they good? And if you go out and buy a Higgins Black Magic today, is it the same ink that you hear people reference back in the day as being a great illustrator's ink? We're going to put that to the test. Now, I can say from personal experience, they are not the same inks. But I'm not going to just make an empty claim. We're going to put it to the test. I'm using some cut up Eon board that I use as a dope sheet. I used the section that says Eon, so you can see that it is indeed Eon board. And the reason I'm using this is, well, I use Eon board a lot, and so I have dope sheets of Eon board. And anytime I get a blemish and I splatter some ink, well, that becomes a dope sheet. But Eon board is notoriously, it says it on the website, not compatible with thinner inks, such as Black Magic and Ultra Draw. Specifically, those two inks perform poorly. They bleed on the paper, and they bleed on almost every paper, those two inks. But did it always used to be that way? I don't think so. I don't remember Black Magic acting like that. So I was actually able to get a hold of, by sheer coincidence, some Sanford Black Magic. So let's go through some unboxings, see if there's any differences or any similarities, and let's dig right into it. So we're going to start off with a Chartpak. This is what you would be buying at Michael's or any other art store or anywhere, really. We're going to open it up and let's take a look. Yellow adhesive, simple cardboard box. Instructions on the back. Basically says it's great for calligraphy, brush, technical pens, and airbrush. It's waterproof, fade-proof, pigment-based drawing ink. It's an intense semi-flat black. We're going to give it a good shake up, and let's look at the labeling. It's just kind of printed on the bottle, 1 fluid ounce. Kind of very poor printing information. Waterproof drawing ink number 44011, chart pack. Let's look at the Sanford. Pretty much identical packaging. On the back, it says the same thing. It's just in a different order. Intense semi-flat black. It produces the most opacity available. I don't know about that, but let's open it up. Again, yellow adhesive. All right, so let's compare the bottles. So there you have your printing differences. So there is some difference in the bottle, as you can see there. I mean, the bottle itself is the same exact shape and size and design, but there is some difference in the printing. The screen printing is done better on the Sanford ones. Similar plastic. The printing on the back. Made in USA. Made in USA. All seems very similar, except for the brand. Let's give this a good shake up as well, but let's go ahead and see how these work. Let's start off with the chart pack, which is what you'd buy now. And I'm going to test this with a regular Hunt 102 and with a G pen. And let's throw some lines. All right. Oh, hold on. Not surprisingly. All right. There you can clearly see this ink bleeds. So I'm going to use my trusty Nico G. Place some ink on the nib. Because maybe it's the scratchiness of the nib that makes it bleed. Maybe a smoother nib will perform better. Here you can see the nib itself does not make any significant difference. It bleeds no matter what. But what about performance with a brush? Man, that's a very good question. Let's try it with a brush. So we will be using a DaVinci Maestro Series 11, size 4, which is a Kolinsky sable brush. We'll dip it in our ink. All right. And let's throw a couple lines. At first look, appears to be fairly dark, but okay, here you can clearly see, especially in this region right around there, there is still some minor bleeding even with a brush, and that the black is kind of, it absorbs weird into the paper. It looks kind of washed out. Definitely not intensely opaque. So let's see how the Sanford variety holds up. Again, give it a little stir. We'll start off again with our trusted Hunt 102. We'll suck some of that up and put it on the nib. And let's throw some lines. So interestingly enough, I've done this test before filming this, but it was a different bottle. And it did not bleed, but this one is bleeding, and it's actually about the same, if not worse. But let's try it with the G pen. As you can see, the results are less than stellar with the regular G pen as well. So let's go on over to our brush. Very similar results with the brush, minor feathering, the ink's kind of washed out, you can see where it layers, very similar results. This brings up an even more interesting thing. Maybe this ink bottle went through another revision while at Sanford. I don't know. So we're going to try a third test. What we're going to do is I have a bottle of some Sanford Black Magic that I have kind of just collected. And we're going to pour off a little bit into my nice little ink container that you see here. Just a little bit of ink in there. Again, using our trusty Hunt 102, if I can get it in there. There, I got some on there. That was difficult. That wide mouth bottle is not as wide mouth as I'd hoped. We still have some bleeding, although not as significant. We do still have some bleeding, but let's test it with a brush. I seem to have lost my brush. Here we go. Let's see if the brush performance is any better. Well, the performance doesn't seem to be any different. Very washed out. Minor bleeding. All right, for shits and giggles, let's try out the vintage stuff. See if we get any different result. Gonna have to stir this stuff up really well. Dip my pen in way too far. We're getting some interesting results now. Now we're getting somewhere. Before I do the close-up, let's go on to the brush. All right, so final verdicts. So there's a definite difference in performance between the vintage ink and the more modern two variants. In my experience in previous testing, the Sanford is hit or miss on whether or not it's going to bleed on certain papers. Obviously, the collected ink I have bled a little bit less, but still washed out. However, this is the vintage. The vintage ink had little to no bleeding, as you can see there. On the nib, the vintage ink is a little more intense, maybe a little bit more of a sheen. But on the brush, it definitely layered more and kind of responded a little bit more like Speedball Super Black in the way that it layered and absorbed into the papers. There's definitely a difference in the ink formulation. Take it how it is. Is it myth busted or myth confirmed? Well, I would say it's definitely myth confirmed between the vintage Higgins Black Magic and the newer iterations of it. As far as between Sanford and Chart Pack, well, what I will say is I'm not the only one that shares the experience that Chart Pack kind of ruined their ink and made it more watery. Now, it may be this particular 2016 Eon board that's causing some performance difference between the two inks. Who knows? But in previous testing, there was a clear difference between the two inks. But it is what it is. And just for those curious, this is what the vintage box looks like. There you go. But there you have it. I would say it's myth confirmed. There was some performance difference between the Sanford ink and the Chart Pack ink, with the Sanford ink being slightly darker, but it seems to vary from bottle to bottle. But the vintage ink did handle much better, despite it actually being on the more liquid side from what I've kind of heard of about the vintage Faber-Castell version. But it is what it is. Maybe they change the ink, maybe they don't. Only time will tell. Maybe we'll see in 20 or 30 more years if your favorite black ink no longer performs like it used to. Hey guys, it's Time Machine Ryan here, and I did a secondary test on newer 2019 stock Eon board, which shows a little bit more drastic results. The chart pack ink bled significantly more than the Sanford, but there was still some bleeding. The Faber-Castell, on the other hand, again, didn't have any bleeding with the nib, but still had the interesting layering effect with the brush, which is probably due to the fact it's an older ink and some of the pigments settled and it's no longer properly suspended in a colloidal solution like it's supposed to be. But anyways, I thought the results were kind of interesting. Anyway, guys, if you liked the video, like it. If you disliked it, dislike it. Leave a comment below and share with me some ideas for the next video. Have a nice day.